Unto the Hills by Margaret Walker Freel. Chapter 6. Spring was unusually late in the year 1830, but along with it came another little girl to the family of John and Mary Scott. John wanted to name this latest addition to their family after Mary. Mary was pleased, but questioned, how on earth will we know which Mary? John quickly remedied the situation. We will give her your full name and throw in an extra name so we won't get mixed up. We will call her Mary Ann Maria, and we'll call her Maria. Down came the Brown family Bible once again, this time to record the name of Scott's fourth child, Mary Ann Maria Scott, born March 15th, 1840. When John Scott walked into the community store in Wilkesboro, he found, as usual, a group of men standing around talking. William Wogg had the group's attention as he said, I hear people are going into the Indian Nation. Some go to look around, but others are staying. They say it's fine country. How do you get land from the Indians? Asked Joel Van Noy. I thought all that land belonged to them by treaties that our government signed. They tell me that they are making trades with the Indians. They say that not only is the land good for farming, there are also tales about gold and silver. Young William Walker, 19-year-old son of Charles Walker, was listening intently to the conversation. William was the grandson of an Irish immigrant who had settled in Yancey County in 1770. He had inherited from his Irish grandfather the love of land and the desire to own land. How much do they pay the Indians? He asked. Is the land high? I don't see how they can trade with Indians when they can't speak the Cherokee language. They tell me you can swap such a thing as chickens for several acres of good land, responded Wogg. At this point, John Scott joined in the conversation. You know, I believe I would like to go out there. It's getting pretty crowded here. I like the idea of new country where there is plenty of elbow room. Young Walker's interest was aroused. There must be wonderful opportunities out there. I sure would like to see that country. Let's go out there, Mr. Scott. Walker, do you think your father could manage without you here? Asked William Wogg. If things open up there, money could be made with a trading post. Unlike the others who had made the trek south on the wagon train from Pennsylvania, William did not become a farmer, but had become prosperous dealing and buying and selling land. He was ever on the lookout for opportunities to invest and hopefully turn a profit. William Walker shook his head. No, I doubt if he could manage without me yet. There would be just the girls to help for a while. Alfred is not old enough to do many things. Then he added wistfully, I sure would like to go. I think I would like working in a store. I'll talk to Paul, and as soon as he can get along without me, I'll go. So, there the matter of invading Indian country dropped for a while. Life continued very much the same for John Scott family. About every 2 years, a new name was added to the growing list in the family Bible. Susan Carolina Scott, born January 12, 1831. Tirzah Adeline Scott, born September 4, 1833. Eliza Orilla Scott, born July 31, 1835. Throughout these years, each time the men of the area gathered in Wogg's community store, the talk turned to space and opportunities awaiting the hardy who had moved to the mountains in southwestern North Carolina. One day John Scott rushed home, burst open the door, and announced to his family without warning, Mary, we are moving to Valleytown in Cherokee County in the spring. Start planning and packing. If lightning had struck the house, the occupants could not have been more stunned. Mary and Margaret stood aghast and stared. Even the crawling and crying babies on the floor were hushed as if sensing the tension in the air. Suddenly, Mary Trinkle Scott laid her head on the table and sobbed. No one spoke. All watched in awed silence. Then, Just as suddenly, Mary lifted her head and spoke, quietly but defiantly. John Scott, you brought me away from a good home and all my people to this wilderness. I have slaved and had babies till I am an old woman before my time. Now that life is getting a little easier, you want me to pack up and start all over again? I tell you, I can't do it. At this point, her head fell on her arms and the sobbing began again. John was stunned. His sweet, pliant Mary had never shown this much spunk before. Oh, Mary, I'm sorry. He dropped to his knees beside Mary and put his arms around her. I didn't mean to startle you. I know you've worked hard. Then he added pleadingly, Please, Mary, this might be our real opportunity. We could get rich. Maybe we could get some of the nice things you've done without. Maybe you wouldn't have to work so hard. The land is good and they're selling it cheap. Come with me. Let's go outside and talk. He took Mary's hand to lead her out the door. Margaret, you start supper. Marie, you mind the babies. Margaret slipped to her mother's side. Mother, I'll help you. Maybe we should go to this new country with Pa. Mary did not answer, but she squeezed Margaret's young hand gratefully as she silently accepted the offered strength and understanding from this, her firstborn, on whom she had relied so many times in the past. She turned and followed John out the door. There they stood in the still of the cold winter's night, John and Mary in each other's arms, each remembering the best of the past, neither remembering the pain or troubles. John broke the silence. Mary, I'm sorry about all the hard work. I'm sorry about everything that has hurt you. I love you. Once again, Mary remembered her words to her mother when she had left her home to come to this new land. I love John, and I want to go where he wants to go. Now, was it any different from then? Of course not. John, I'll still go with you, anywhere, anytime. Chapter 7. Now 14 years after their first wagon train left Pennsylvania, William Wogg found himself once again wagon master to a hardy group of eager pioneers, searching for new lands and adventure. This time, instead of a small band leaving home for the first time, the wagon train was made up of seasoned travelers with large families and numerous possessions. Along with the Woggs and the Scotts, the Joel Van Oy family and young William Wogg were added to the group. The distance to be covered by this caravan was considerably shorter than the long trek from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to Wilkes County, North Carolina. However, the farewells were as sad and the leave-taking of the familiar just as painful. Charles and Susanna Walker were particularly tearful, since their eldest son was leaving the family to go homestead in the mountains to the west. Margaret Scott, now 13, had been but a wee babe when she was brought by her parents to settle in the Yadkin Valley. As with most pioneer children, Margaret was already assuming the responsibilities of an adult. She was a capable and eager worker. As she watched the tearful farewells of the older ones, she could scarcely conceal her youthful exuberance. She eagerly looked forward in happy anticipation to the journey into the unknown. William Billy Walker, who was traveling alone, had been assigned to drive one of the Scots wagons. He was seated in the front, holding the reins ready to leave when his parents approached the wagon. Billy, be a good son. If you need anything, let us know, said his father as he extended a slightly trembling hand toward his son. In the hand was a large, heavy watch and chain. Since you are our oldest, I want you to have this. It was my father's, and now it's yours. Billy was taken aback. Here was the family treasure being offered to him. Pa? Grandpa's watch? Do you really want me to have it? Oh, I'll take good care of it. His hands fumbled uncertainly as he placed the watch in his pocket and adjusted the heavy chain. His father continued as he sternly admonished. William, remember you are an Irishman. If your country needs you, answer the call. Be ready to give your life, if necessary, for liberty and freedom. Work hard, save your money, and get some land. All Irishmen need land. Almighty God makes more people, but he'll never make any more dirt. Pay your preacher, pay your debts, and always be honest. Up front, the creak of the wagons could be heard as they began to roll forward. There was a chorus of shouted goodbyes, and Susanna Walker reached up and kissed her son. Then she turned to Margaret as she sat in the back of the wagon with her 3 younger siblings who were to be her charges throughout the trip. "Margaret, take care of Billy for us." Margaret flushed slightly, but answered firmly, "Yes, Mrs. Walker, I'll do my best. I'll try to take care of him." She waved happily as their wagon joined in behind the others. As she watched the people who had come to bid them farewell pass from sight, Margaret wondered if she would ever return to the Yadkin Valley. However, typical of her youthful age, she didn't waste many thoughts on the past. She abruptly turned them to the future as she settled back for the long journey west. On the first day's journey, the wagon train followed the Yadkin River, and then toiled up Bushy Mountain, where they decided to camp. The next night was spent on the Catawba River near a small settlement called Morganton. The following day was spent following the meandering Catawba. The fourth day found the travelers slowly and tediously ascending the Blue Ridge Mountains. Finally, after 5 days' travel, the party reached the community of Asheville in Buncombe County, where they made camp near the French Broad River. Since this was the largest village along the entire route to the west, the travelers paused here to rest and renew supplies before starting out on the remainder of the journey. Locust Old Field, near Pigeon River in Haywood County, was their next pause. Here they found a goodly number of settlers. Haywood County had already been known for its good soil, and pioneers had settled this region early. Climbing Balsam Mountain was not an easy task. Men and children had to walk in order to lighten the load on the animals. That night was spent in camp near the Tuckasegee River. The next morning the travelers crossed Cowee Mountains and by nightfall had reached the community of Franklin, formerly Nickawasi, a sacred town of the Cherokee Indians. The 9th day brought the worst ordeal of the entire journey. After following Cartaguche Creek for a long time, the wagon train started ascending the Nantahala Mountains. The road, though having the name the Great State Road, was nothing more than a trail. Everybody except the baby had to walk. Many times the journey was delayed because the entire adult group had to assist in holding up the heavily loaded wagons to keep them from overturning. The road climbed the mountains in a zigzag fashion, making many abrupt turns. Frequently, 4 horses had to be hitched abreast to navigate the sharp, steep curves. At last, the weary travelers reached the top. Waya Gap. A tired but happy group lay down that night. The worst of the journey was behind them, and there had been no mishap. The sun, shining through the propped-up canvas of the wagon, awakened Margaret. She was alert, but loath to move as she lay there watching the sun making rainbows out of dewdrops. Her happy visions of what the future might hold for her were interrupted, and she was abruptly returned to the prosaic world by a call from her sisters. "Hurry, Margaret, it's time to milk the cows." In spite of their eagerness to get to their new home, the party decided to delay their departure from atop this beautiful mountain in order to enjoy its majestic spectacle. They climbed to Waya Bald, from which they could see in all directions. There they stood in awed silence, which was finally broken by Joel Vanoy when he said, "This mountain is said to be over 5,000 feet high." From here they could see down into the valleys and across in a distance as the mountains seemed piled one on the other. "Mary, it's like the scripture you read from the Bible last night, a land of hills and valleys. I think of another quotation about the stones being of iron and digging brass out of the hills. I'm going to mine these mountains." Margaret's eyes were shining as she said to her mother, I think of the psalm about, I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills. I love these mountains already. John, ever the tiller of soil, was looking down rather than at the distant beauty. He saw the dwarfed and dwindling vegetation covering the high mountain top. I wonder what caused this baldness. I've heard many stories about these balds, said Colonel Wogg, who was the only member of the party to have visited the area before. This isn't the only one. Such balds are scattered throughout these mountains. There are none in the Blue Ridge chain, but there are many in the Smokies, the Nantahalas, the Snowbirds, and the Valley River Mountains. I know the names of 5 of these balds, some of which are Cherokee Indian names. Waya, this here one, then there's Tehala, Wachicha, Tusquity, and then there's Weatherman's Bald. Most of them are above 5,000 feet high. Some say trees won't grow above the water level, but we all know that there are mountains higher than that which do have trees. Others say the soil is bad, but grass will grow here. The Indians tell several tales. One is that the balds are the devil's footsteps as he walked over the mountain tops. The group burst into amused laughter as they turned from the top of the mountain and started back to their camp. Here they packed and soon were making their way down the mountain. Once again, many of the party were afoot. The morning was beautiful and the children were playing alongside the wagons as they slowly moved ahead. Soon they tired of this and decided to move on ahead of the wagon train and look for wildflowers. Merrily the group vaulted the rocks and logs, crept under the low bushes in their search for early trailing arbutus among the forest leaves. Recklessly they scampered about, forgetting to keep track of the lumbering wagon train. The children were unaware of the passage of time until little Eliza grew tired and started to whine. I don't want to hunt flowers. I want to go back and ride in the wagon. All the children stopped and listened. There was no sound of the wagon train. How far had they wandered? Emily broke the silence with a frightened whisper. Margaret, we're lost. She started crying and in no time was joined by the rest of the party. Margaret's face was serious, but she did not join the tearful chorus. Very quietly and sensibly she said, Let's sit down and rest while we think. Sternly she spoke to the group. Stop crying. Obediently to the authority in Margaret's voice, the younger children ceased their sobbing and sat down in a frightened huddle. Margaret sat with her head in her hands and thought for a few moments. Emily, she said at last, we've been going downhill all afternoon, haven't we? Of course, Emily's face brightened. That means that if we continue going downhill, we're bound to run into the road again. The way that road zigzags, it can't be too far from us. That's what I was thinking, said Margaret. Let's rest a little while longer and then keep right on down the mountain, and we are sure to find them before dark. Adelaide looked towards the sun. It's a long time until sundown. Then she said, Let's play a game as we go. Let's see who can take the biggest steps. When we finish the game, we'll see the wagons, I'll bet. She was putting up a brave front to reassure the younger children. The little faces brightened up as they joined in the game. With Margaret leading the procession, the children hurried down the mountain. Time passed, but the children did not lose heart and start crying again. Over rocks and logs, crawling through the underbrush, one by one the children continued their downward trek. An eerie cry sounded through the forest. The children were frozen in their flight. What was it? It wasn't the cry of the human. And then they saw it. Emily, I think it's a panther. Margaret snatched up little Eliza and thrust her towards Emily. Here, take her and run as fast as you can down the hill. Everybody follow Emily. She and Adelaide grabbed up 2 large sticks. We just gotta find Pa. Now another sound could be heard in the forest. This time it was a welcome sound. It's people, gasped Emily. It's Pa, she screamed. Run, Pa! Margaret heard the cat coming closer. She turned towards it with her stick upraised. It was approaching at great speed. She turned and ran faster and faster, praying as she ran. Just as she felt she could go no further, she felt herself being shoved aside as Billy Walker struck the animal over the head with the butt of his gun. The stunned cat lay in the leaves. John Scott was right behind Billy, and he sent a quick bullet into its quivering body to finish the task. There was no thought of recriminations, so thankful were the parents to have their children back with them. They quietly made camp a few miles short of their planned destination that night. A small nosegay of early blooming trailing arbutus lay forgotten and unnoticed to rot by a large log in the Nantahala Mountains. Many days the caravan had traveled into an unbroken primeval wilderness. As they emerged suddenly into an opening, a lovely green valley, completely encircled by towering mountains, spread before them and presented a breathtaking scene. The lush emerald valley seemed almost tropical. The multitudinous mountains sprawled into the dim blue distance, seemingly to infinity. Ethereal white clouds floated overhead and silently mingled and communed with the massive mountain peaks. Here was displayed a triumphant pageantry, the culmination of Almighty God's handiwork and masterpiece. Here was God's country. Nestled in the clearing was the scattered village of Valleytown, so recently vacated by the Cherokee Nation. Many small log cabins with smoke curling upward gave welcome evidence of the presence of humanity. In the distance could be seen the romantic Conahita or Valley River meandering its way through the valley. The begrimed and dirty but joyous travelers stood silent as though worshiping at God's sanctuary. Margaret Scott's hand clutched her throat as she began repeating the words of the psalmist. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills. And then she whispered softly, Oh, how I love the mountains. This is where I've always wanted to be.